All right, thanks, Kevin, and thank you, Dr. Baumeister, for joining us. We're looking forward to talk. Welcome back, everybody. Just a brief introduction, and then you can get started. Dr. Roy F. Baumeister is a research psychologist, currently at University of Queensland in Australia. He has nearly 700 scientific publications. His 41 books include the New York Times bestseller, Willpower, Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength, and a new book, The Power of Bad, both with science writer John Tierney. His works have been cited in the scientific literature nearly 200,000 times, which is among the highest scores of any field. Today, he's going to present, I think, a couple studies on everyday thoughts about the future. His own work, I will say personally, his own work on free will and willpower have influenced my own work, and I'm appreciative of that. And his contributors today are also Wilhelm Hoffman, Philip Reese, Amy Somerville, and Kathleen Voss. And again, this is everyday thoughts about the future. And again, use the Q&A function, and I'll try to moderate questions at the end of the talk. So thank you, Dr. Baumeister. Ready when you are. I think you're muted still.
Yes, I unmuted. Okay.
Thanks.
No, I can't start screen while you are sharing.
Okay. I think Kevin, can he share screen now?
He should be able to. Yeah, I released that just about 30 seconds ago.
All right. Let me know if you have any troubles with that.
All right, hang on. Trying. Is that working?
Yes. I can see it.
All right, and let's get the slideshow started. Jesus. Here comes start. All right. Delighted to be here. As Jason mentioned, I'm basically a laboratory experimental research psychologist, but in the past decade, I have gotten into some experience sampling studies, and so I'm going to talk about one big one today, and time permitting, a bit on the second one relevant to the willpower issue that Jason mentioned. But let me start with this one, thinking about the future. The report for this is now in press for people who want more details. I think it's available online and should be out in the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin sometime this year. All right, the goal of this, the purpose of it was, distraction here. The purpose of this was to understand what people think about. And by way of context, there are thousands, probably tens of thousands of laboratory studies on human thought processes. But in the laboratory, you got people focused, you tell them what to think about, and then you ask them what they think, or you measure it in some way. So there's a lot of value in that, but does it resemble what people are actually thinking about as they go about their daily lives? So our approach was to try to beat people during their daily life and see the content of everyday thoughts. And a particular focus of this was the use of time, past, present, future. So we wanted to know what emotions, thoughts, and other things particularly relevant to thinking about the future, which has been one of my intellectual interests in recent years. There we go. And this is follow-up. We'd had a previous study on desires, and if people are interested in that, that's with Wilhelm Hoffman. Took the lead on those, and these are several papers. Beeping people throughout the day at random points to see, did they have a desire? Motivation, desire is one of the basic questions in psychology, but we didn't know how often do people even have desires? Do they have them all the time? Do they have them just now and then? And so on. So that yielded a wealth of interesting findings and so on. And I said, well, let's do the same thing with thoughts. The method, we recruited about 500 people. Hoffman supervised this part of it. So he was in Chicago at the time. So these are mainly from the Chicago area. And as you can see, we got people minimum age of 18, but had quite a diverse span of ages, and we're able then to look at effects of age as well. The thing was set up, they could choose whether to start at 8 a.m. or at 9 a.m., depending on their schedule. And then it went for 12 hours. And over the next 12 hours in 2-hour chunks, we would beep them within each 2-hour chunk with a little bit of a correction so it didn't come right at the end of one 2 hours and right at the beginning of next, so almost one right after the other. We got them for 3 days. Looking back, I wish we'd gotten one more day, but you know, it's a big thing to manage and also quite expensive. The basic assignment was when the beeper goes off, for this when it was on their telephones. So when the phone dings you, report on the most recent thought in your mind. So that was the goal. As I said, we were mainly interested in the time dimension. There's a question of how do you want to measure the time dimension of the thought. Now, other studies have begun to do this, and we've been doing this for a while, and some others have been done and published in the meantime. And what they usually do is ask people, well, was your thought about past or present or future? But I'm pleased that we took a different path. We had them rate past, present, and future separately. So they could say all of the above or none of the above. And that added quite a bit of information, as I'll explain. And indeed, about a quarter of the thoughts, people said there was no time dimension. So if we had simply forced them to pick past, present, or future, they would have shoveled their data into one of those categories. But I think reflects the importance of adapting your measures to all the possibilities of human thought. We also had quite a few where people mentioned multiple of what we called time zones being past, present, and future. Now, there's a question of what do you mean by the present? Are you thinking about the present? For some people, it might mean this year. For some people, it might mean this very second. For many, it means this week. Some things people guess on average, they think the future starts in about 3 days. So we had to make an executive decision because we didn't want people responding on a different basis. I mean, sometimes you can leave it up to people to say whatever you think the present means. But what I decided is it's going to be a very narrow window because we're particularly interested in thinking about future and past. So we said the future starts in 5 minutes. So this was an instruction given to the past ended 5 minutes ago. So the present is just 10 minutes long. And, some people might say, in a race or in physics or whatever, it's just this nanosecond of the present. So even while you're saying a sentence, the first part of the sentence is in the past and the rest of the sentence is in the future. But experientially, they say the future is a saddleback, not a knife edge. So I thought with the 5 minutes each way, the 10-minute saddle, that was a good way to do it. And you can question whether that was the right thing, but we wanted to have everybody responding on the same basis. As you'll see, we were also able to repeat the analyses starting the future a month from now or a week from now and so on. But the basic response was the future starts in 5 minutes. So the basic question, how often do people think about the future, past or present? Here are the basic original numbers. As you see, people are mostly thinking about the present, but they think about the future a lot more than the past. And this is interesting because psychology has a huge emphasis on the past. I think we in psychology have borrowed causal models from the natural sciences in which causality only moves forward through time and in very short steps from one moment or 1 second to the next. In psychology, our causal models are your reinforcement history or your childhood experiences or your socialization and so on. Anyway, explaining the present based on the past is common. And in people who study thoughts, there's huge volumes of work on memory, quite a bit less on people thinking forward into the future. But our data suggests, well, maybe some shift of emphasis is called for. People are certainly thinking about the future, as you see, 3.5 times as much as the past. Now, sharp-eyed ones among you may have noticed these don't add up to 100%, but that's because we had other possibilities. So here's the full table, and with the decimal point too, so a little bit more precise. So as I said, people were permitted to say, yes, I'm thinking about both the past and the present. Although that came up only 2%. the striking findings on this table, the bottom line, again, a quarter of the thoughts had no time dimension. And these are things like people maybe watching some television programs or having sexual fantasies or doing their algebra. There are plenty of things in which there's not a clear past, present, or future focus. Anyway, a sizable number of thoughts fit that. So that enables us to compare thoughts that have time versus ones that don't have time. And of the combinations, well, mostly they're little, except present plus future was very common, and indeed almost as common as the future only. So again, if you add those in, then there are really quite a lot of thoughts about the future. Over a quarter of the thoughts, 14 and 12 and 2, had at least some dimension of thinking about the future. So the future is very much on people's minds. The past, especially purely the past, is beloved by researchers on memory and so on. Well, you know, certainly those are important thoughts too, but again, they're not nearly as common. So we had to set up, I should say as an aside, Hoffman asked Voss and me to design the protocol, you know, what exactly the questions we want to ask. So we thought about everything we could, and we sent them this long list. And he said, well, you just can't ask people to stop in the middle of their day when they're doing stuff to answer all these questions. So we arranged that not every response would get all the questions. And so when I say, if they said the future, then we asked them this. Well, not everybody was asked this. Everybody was asked past, present, or future separately, but then different questions followed up, because you know you have a sizable amount of data, and it's enough to detect patterns there. So in terms of thinking about the future, well, later today is by far the most common, and they're thinking about the future, but not very far into the future. So you see, over half are later today, and they could check more than one on this, as I mentioned. So tomorrow, a few days, and so on. After about a year, it drops off. People don't think very much about the future beyond a year from now. The past, same kind of thing. Earlier today really was the most common. So when the mind goes back in time, earlier today is the most common. And then yesterday, a few days ago, and so on. The past, the shelf seems much longer. It drops off about 10 years ago. You know, more than 10 years ago, people don't think about that very often. So the majority of thoughts about the past are ranged from earlier today, being the most common, and then back to about 10 years. Now, I mentioned a fair number of thoughts had no time dimension. Comparing these against other thoughts, we were able to look at the other ratings, and these are significant differences. The thoughts that have no time dimension were less meaningful than thoughts that had any time positive response. They're less under voluntary control. The mental fatigue one is something I'll come back to, but less exciting. All the emotions were less common: happy, angry, anxious, stress, disappointment. Less common in thoughts that are outside of time. So again, it suggests that our experience of emotion tends to be grounded in time. Thoughts without time tended to be more about the self. Also, when people are together with other people, their thoughts are more focused in time, particularly the present. The present seems to be the social time. But of the 8 categories, all the different time responses, and then the no time response, 7 of them were more common with other people than when alone. In other words, all the time ones you're more likely to have when you're with other people. The no time thoughts were more common alone. So pulling this together, the richness of human experience occurs within a time frame. Meaningfulness, emotion, social life, all that happens in time, but the mind, the solitary mind, does wander, hence the involuntary wander, more when alone. And these thoughts have sort of less experiential richness. Then we asked them, what were you thinking about? What was the content of the thought? And for this, we gave them a list of categories, and they could check again as many as replied. So as applied. So when they're thinking about the past, well, what kind of surprised us here, if you go down to the line second from the bottom, implications of the past for the future. this was by far the most common, or at least by somewhat the most common thought. So even when people are thinking about the past, it often has a future aspect to it. That, you know, what do I learn from it? What do I have to deal with? What are other implications of the past for the future? So that was the most common. Again, thinking that, you know, psychology is focused on the past. You know, while there's some value there, it's missing a big part of the story. Other things, think about the past, replaying thoughts over and over again, trying to figure out and make sense of things, and so on. If you go through these together, my sort of nutshell summary of when people think about the past, it's so what and what the heck. And I mean, the so what are the implications for the future, and the what the heck is, you know, trying to understand, figure out, deduce, interpret the implications of things that happened in the past. So thinking backward, that's the most common categories. Moving to the present, again, there's a kind of a pragmatic focus. The two most common there are doing what you intend to do, what you're supposed to do, and also zeroed in, you know, paying attention to what you are doing. If you notice, again, the next to the bottom line, the implications of the present for the future was also common here, and one of the more frequent responses. So even when they're thinking about the present, again, suggesting the psychology of the individual mind is often somewhat forward-looking, and so past and present, we're looking for what does it mean for the future. So implications of the thoughts on the present, these are pragmatic, you're focused on what you're doing, but some of them do not have a pragmatic aspect. You're sort of enjoying the moment, savoring the delights of listening to music or eating a sandwich or making love or whatever. That doesn't necessarily have a pragmatic aspect, but a lot of them do. All right, now let's get to thinking about the future. Here's another surprise to us. You look at the top line, 3/4 of the time when people say they're thinking about the future, they are planning. Obviously, we thought planning would be a part of it, but not that it would dominate, you know, to that extent. It's basically close to double what the next highest categories are. So planning is extremely important. And as you see, a lot of the others are there, what you hope to do, you know, imagining things in the future, what you hope will happen. This is what really got us onto thinking, you know, going back to the idea William James mentioned that thinking is for doing. He says whenever he's thinking, you know, the purpose of thoughts are always to prepare for action. And we can't quite say always, but a lot of them. And certainly thinking about the future, planning is highly pragmatic because it's mapping out what you are going to do in this or that situation. But if you go down to like worries, that's not pragmatic. So there are some that don't fit that. So William James, great genius, is basically on target, probably a little bit overstated, but anytime a social psychologist says always, he or she is asking for trouble. So from the forward-looking thoughts, as I said, highly pragmatic, planning things, preparing, anticipating what's going to happen. A lot of them emphasize multiple possibilities, uncertainty. I don't know what's going to happen. This is possible, imagining different opportunities. And this has led us to think of the future as, you know, we're tentatively calling them the matrix of maybe. Now, by way of context for this, I said psychologists mostly study thoughts about the past and the present. When they do get into thinking about the future, you know, because they say periodically, well, we should study people's thoughts about the future. So I don't know, what should we study? Well, let's see what they predict is going to happen. And prediction really dominates the research literature on prospection, which is a term for thinking about the future. And well, prediction is important. You know, there's a lot of interesting work going on there. But our results kind of pushed us to shift emphasis. It's not so much predicting what's going to happen as preparing for how you're going to deal with it. In a sense, you're not sort of trying to predict the outcome, but to predict the choice points where there are multiple possibilities where you will have to either know what to say, or, you know, be prepared to perform well, or be prepared for what decision you might have to make. So it's a somewhat different map of the future that you're looking forward, not to where the journey is going to end, but where the crossroads are going to be, because that's where you will have to, as an agent, you make a choice and deal with it and decide which way to go. We did look at planning, since it emerged as such a big category, compared planning against all other thoughts about the future, which again include worrying and various other things. So planning is rating, people like planning better than other thoughts. It's certainly more pleasant than worrying. They rate it as more meaningful, seems to produce lower levels of stress and anger and anxiety. It takes effort. Planning doesn't happen automatically. You have to do controlled thinking. This is the difference between controlled and automatic thoughts. That's a major category in psychology. Sometimes some things the mind does automatically, and sometimes you have to exert control. Planning, it seems you have to exert control. Mental fatigue, low willpower kind of thing. Planning takes energy and effort. So when people are sort of wiped out, they don't want to bother making plans. And we have since then done some experimental work to manipulate people's mental fatigue, and sure enough, it makes them not want to plan. So it suggests to me, if you're worried about stuff in the future, one thing to do is to make a plan, because that will shift. Worrying is kind of unpleasant, but planning reduces the stress and the anxiety, and is a more satisfying activity to engage in. All right, next I want to go to the subjective experience of time. So the responses, as I said, if they said they're thinking about the future, then we ask, well, is it later today or tomorrow or next few days or whatever? And then we could correlate these responses with how they rated on how they were feeling at that moment and get it. Now, people could check multiple things. I'm thinking about today and tomorrow and next week. Well, in those cases, we picked the time that was farthest from the present. Since our interest was in what's called mental time travel, we picked the time farthest from the present. So some of the things, when they say they're thinking about the future, they might also be thinking about the present or something closer to home. But anyway, that was an analysis strategy that we adopted given the theoretical interest. And just so you can see how it goes, so here's a sample data. So this is how happy they rated themselves. That's the blue curve. And incidentally, we analyzed everything for both linear and curved quadratic effects, and you could get either or both. So the line, the vertical line in the middle at 0, that's the present moment. And so the time is along the bottom. So +1 is later today, +2 is tomorrow, +3 is the next few days, +4 the coming week, 5 is the month, and so on, going up to after my death, after my life is over. And then on the left side of the screen, -1 is earlier today, -2 is yesterday, -3, and so on. So as you can see, happiness is highest when your thoughts are right in the present. So I encourage everyone listening, pay close attention to what I'm saying. Don't think about the past and future, and that will help you be happy. Just kidding. But in general, happiness is highest with thoughts right at the present. Now, we had actually predicted this because we thought emotions exist in the present moment, and they focus attention on the present moment, and so on. So we thought, well, really, all emotions should have a peak in the present, and that's what we found with happiness. But that was the only one. The negative emotions showed a different picture. In fact, anger, and I should say, if you take a close look at the anger data, it probably is more than a quadratic function, because people were still pretty angry about stuff that happened yesterday, if they were thinking about it. But in general, this was the best fit of the curve. So anger is least when you focus on the present. Anxiety, the same thing, lowest when the thoughts are focused right here and now. It's even a strategy that some people use to get over anxiety, because anxieties are associated with what's going to happen in the future, what does this mean, or what something traumatic or upsetting happened in the past. If you can get your thoughts right here, well, things don't seem so bad right at this present moment. So again, anxiety is lowest there. So so the good emotions peak in the present, the bad emotions are lowest in the present. Now, if you know emotion theory, the good bad emotions, that's one dimension, but they also measure the arousal dimension. So it's called the circumplex theories. And so these go from high energy, high excitement to low arousal, low energy and excitement. So in terms of negative emotions, anger is a high, anger feels bad, but it's a high arousal one, whereas sadness is a low arousal negative feeling. So you wanted to ask the arousal dimension too. Problem with that is that when you ask ordinary people, do you feel arousal right now? They think you're talking about sexual arousal. And well, I'm sure that's interesting too, but that's not what we were looking for in this. So we asked them how excited as a substitute. It's not perfect, but as close as we could get. Anyway, there's no curve here. This is a pure linear effect. The future is really exciting and arousing. The past is basically boring, and that boring or depressing, I guess. So a linear effect there. Stress, we had the same thing. If you can get your attention right in the present, it's lower than when your mind starts to roam into past and future. We asked people, in addition to happiness, how pleasant or unpleasant is the thought itself? That you were having. Was it a nice thing to think about? And here we got an even sharper curve than with happiness. And incidentally, both the linear and the quadratic effects are significant here. So the future is more pleasant than the past, but the present is most. Actually, it looks like the peak is not quite the present, but is a little bit into the future. I don't want to make too much of that because I don't know. A statistically significant difference, but it is sort of interesting that the curve is off there into the future. It reminds me of one of the well-known studies by my friend George Lowenstein, the economist. And economists, when they study time, pretty much the present has value. So they'll ask you, you could have $1,000 a year from now or $800 today. Which would you pick? A surprising number of people will pick $800 today, and they call this discounting the future because the economists say, come on, there's no way you can invest $800 legally and have it be $1,000 a year from now. So you're clearly better to take the delayed rewards, but just by being in the future, it's there. Anyway, the economists in general show this big emphasis on the present, but Lowenstein, he found an interesting exception to this. He asked people, how much would you pay for a kiss from your favorite movie star? And you think about that for a moment. And what he found is that people would pay more for a kiss in 3 days than they would pay for a kiss right now. And I assume it's not just so they can go home and brush their teeth, but kiss from your favorite movie star. If you've got 3 days to look forward to it, that adds to the total payoff there. It makes it more valuable that you get to anticipate it and then have it as well. Anyway, for what it's worth, the peak was a little bit into the future. So all what I've said so far fits what the people who talk about mindfulness are saying. And they try to get people, pay attention to right now, keep your mind here, don't wander, think about the past and the future and so on. As we've shown, more positive, less negative emotion here, less stress. Thinking about the present in general is a pleasant thing to think about in general. So overall, it's consistent with mindfulness. But when we ask people to rate the meaningfulness of the thought, it goes a very different way. So thinking about the present it seems to add happiness, but sacrifice meaningfulness. Here, again, both the linear and the quadratic effects are significant. So the future is the most meaningful, then the past, and then the present. And actually looks like maybe yesterday is the low point, or earlier today. Thinking back over things that just happened recently, get the lowest average level of meaningfulness. Conscious control. This is a surprise to me because you see, I asked people how much you control your thoughts, and that was the peak in the present and thinking about the present. But it surprised me because we evolved from animals, and animals only think about the present. There's a very interesting literature on that, going back now a couple decades, that animals are stuck in time. They basically live in the present. I know people talk about, what about squirrels burying nuts for the future, but the squirrel doesn't have any idea that, oh, come winter, it's going to be great to dig up this nut and eat it. There's no sense of the future there. And so animals live in the present, and I thought, well, then the human mind, since it's an animal mind itself, would naturally stay in the present, and it would take mental effort to think into the future and past. But that's clearly wrong based on these data. It actually takes more mental effort to concentrate here and now in the present, to focus on what you're doing. And if you relax and let your mind wander, it tends to wander into the future or into the past. And again, both linear and quadratic effects are significant. So the past is significantly lower than the future. So involuntary thoughts that pop into your mind without, you're trying to think about that at all, those dominate more in thoughts about the past than present or future. The others and self, in retrospect, is not my favorite item, but you're thinking more about yourself than others. The farther you go in the past, the more people say they're thinking about others. It looks like it levels off as you go into the future, but notice that's the 0 point, so that's equally. The future is about equally about self and others, whereas the past is more about others. So from what we've got so far, the present is happy, the future is meaningful. There are lots of curvilinear relationships, so I'm glad we did the quadratic analyses, because often it's past and future that are different from the present. So you call this mental time travel. The mind can move away from the present moment in either forward or backward directions, and that seems to be more different than staying right here on the present. As I said, the tired, fatigued mind wanders in time, away from the present, especially into the past. It takes more effort to stay on the future. The future is exciting, and the future is about both me and others. Okay, a couple more findings, and then I'll wrap up. Compared to, so we looked at thoughts where they rated more than one time zone. So they said present and future, which is the most common, or past and present, or all three of them. And thoughts that combined more of them were more meaningful, higher levels of arousal and excitement, more emotion, anger, frustration, anxiety, and so on, although less happiness. And the happiness data were a little odd on this, because the present plus future combination often had high happiness, but the others, I guess, offset it. So when people are thinking about more than one point in time, then the thought is more meaningful, and again, goes with the idea that we use meaning to connect across time. That's how the mind represents things. Combining cross time, more meaning, but also there's more negative emotion. Meaningfulness often comes with some cost, because you're involved in things that are challenging, or they're struggles, or stressful, or whatever. We asked an item about death because there's a theory in psychology that humans, being the only animals who know we are going to die someday, that this has a big effect on shaping the human psyche. It goes back to Ernest Becker and The Denial of Death, a Pulitzer Prize winning book in the 1970s. So this suggests that thoughts about death should be a big factor in there. Now, others say that it's so upsetting that because of that you block it out of your mind and so on. And I can't quite deal with that. But we wanted to know, do people think about death that often? So we asked that, but no. Basically, people don't. At least they don't admit to thinking about death. About 1 out of every 200 thoughts mention death. And often those were also in the past. So obviously they're not thinking about their own death because they're still alive to be in our study. There's very little thought about mortality, about the fact that you're going to die someday. We certainly didn't find any sign of it in these data. And one more interesting set of data. We wanted to know what kinds of people think about the future. Sort of this is an initial exploratory study. So we wanted to measure personality traits. And then we could correlate them. So people out of 3 days, we beeped them 18 times. They didn't respond all, to every one. I mean, it's understandable if people are driving down the freeway or making love or whatever, that they might not stop to answer our questionnaire. Nevertheless, we could see how often they mentioned that they were thinking about the future and correlate that with, we had about 20 different personality traits, if you include age and gender and everything, because we wanted to see what kinds of people really do think about the future. And we picked some of the standard personality traits like the big five. We picked a variety of others that we thought would be the kind of person who thinks especially about the future. And what did we find? Very little there. This was a big bust. So the implication is most people think about the future. It's not optional. It's something that's really a part and seems to be fairly common across all personality types. And what we did find was all these personality differences that we chose to study who thinks about the future, they did predict how often people think about the past. Even Phil Zimbardo has a questionnaire on future orientation, and that didn't, whether people are high or low in future orientation according to his questionnaire, did not predict how much they think about the future, but it did predict how much they thought about the past. The few differences that did get significant: optimistic people think a little more about the future, happy people, and I guess it's more fun to think about the future if it's going to be pleasant. And perhaps the most interesting theoretically one is people with this need for closure. They want to have things figured out and nailed down and settled in their minds. And so they think more about the future because they don't like to leave things uncertain or undecided. But basically, we struck out in predicting who thinks about the future. Now, in terms of who thinks about the past, we did find a variety of things from the big five: neuroticism, agreeableness, conscientiousness, and so on, all predicted, as well as self-esteem, root depression, stuff like that. Now, I have a colleague, a second here. I have a colleague who worked with us on this, and she says she never thinks about the past. And she saw these data and said, well, look at these people who think about the past. They're not the sort of person you'd want to spend the weekend with. High in neuroticism, which means unpleasant emotions, complaining, and so on. Low agreeableness means they're grumpy, hard to get along with. Conscientious, the people who are not, don't have good self-discipline, aren't trustworthy, reliable. People with low self-esteem, people who ruminate a lot, depressed. That's what comes of thinking a lot about the past. And so she was quite pleased with these results. Obviously, we can't make a causal inference as to whether it's the personality causes the thoughts or the thoughts cause the personality tendency. It's the sort of thing you need to use laboratory studies to do to see if making people think about the past makes them more depressed or more pessimistic. Nevertheless, the finding was rather striking. That thinking a lot about the past seems to have be linked to serious downsides in personality. All right, I'm just about here. Let me go through the final conclusions, and then we'll get to the questions. So with personality, the conclusion is everybody thinks about the future, but thinking about the past is more limited and perhaps not the lovely sorts of people. So main conclusions. We got first the primacy of prospection. They think a lot more about the future than the past. The future plus the present is also important, but the thoughts go forward much more backward in time. As I said, this led us to develop this theory of pragmatic prospection, that when people thinking about the future, it's to prepare for action. Signs fitting that are it's focused on the near future, not so much the distant future. What are you going to do later today? What are you going to do tomorrow? What's the plan for the week? Things like that. A lot of emphasis on multiple possibilities. It's not so much what's definitely going to happen or how it's going to turn out, but what are the choice points? What are the things I'm going to deal with? What are the decisions I'll have to make? Emphasis on what to do. And again, often the link from present to future, that was a very potent, frequent link. And last, in terms of planning, planning in terms of other future thoughts, more meaningful, emotionally positive. It does take mental effort and so on. And the last thing about planning I didn't mention before, we had all our theories of, do people plan more when they're alone or with others? And with a giant data set, it's got to be significant one way or the other, but it wasn't. people to report equal amounts of planning when they're alone or with others. So anyway, I see my time is finished. So here again is the reference for this. So I'm going to skip the other study that I had in case there was time left over. But let's call it quits here, and I'm ready to go discuss issues and answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you very much. So this first question has to do about questions about the temporal trends in past, present, future thinking. And the example they give is, were thoughts about the future more common at certain times of the day? For example, evening, or yeah. Was there any connection between the past, present, future thinking and times of day?
There was a weak one. I should go through it. You know, we had lots of data. We thought maybe at the end of the day people would be thinking about tomorrow, but they weren't. So thinking about the future seems to be spread through most of the day, but then it seems to drop off in the evening.
Okay, great. Thank you. This next one is about the, I guess, questioning about the phenomenology of atemporal or no specific time thoughts. Did you look at the valence or the meaningfulness of that?
Yes, I think I had that result up that that the no time thoughts were less meaningful.
Less meaningful. Okay.
And I'd have to go. Let's see. Do you have my screen off? Should I go?
I know your screen's on, so you can still,
Okay.
you should still be able to navigate it.
Okay. I'd like to look up some of these answers. You know, there's a rich ton of data here.
Yeah.
And I think we'll be putting the data online if other people want to work with them and do other analyses.
You can stop sharing your screen too if you prefer that too.
Oh, no, that's fine.
So one question you answered towards the end, but there was a question about a gender. Was there any gender effect?
There were tiny effects. Women thought a little bit more about the past. And I imagine if you corrected for depression and stuff like that, because women tend to have more depression, that would go away. So to our surprise, the gender, okay, maybe men thought a tiny bit more about one or the present or the future or something, but it didn't seem to be very meaningful. And the effects were so small, I would classify them as basically meaningless, as nothing. And to our surprise, age yielded the same thing. I know people would wonder about that. I mean, it seems logical. Young people have much longer future and a much shorter past. Old people have a much longer past and much less of a future. So you'd think young people think about the future and old people think about the past. It was a nice theoretical prediction, but we did not find it that old people are still thinking about it. Granted, again, remember most thoughts about the future are later today and tomorrow, the next few days, and this week, and so everybody's has that level of concerns. But you know, maybe old people thinking about their legacy after they're dead, you know, that might occur to them as much as a 20-year-old thinks about retirement. So the age thing was a surprise, and the same thing emerged in studies of mind wandering, which you started to get this for, you know, they have people in the laboratory and have them say read a chapter on War and Peace or something, and then interrupt them at random times and say, well, is your mind wandering, or are you focusing on your reading? And then they asked them there, and you know, they did this study with college students and found, sure enough, they thought more about the future than the past. So, well, that's young people. What about old people? So we managed to get a sample of old people all over 60 and put them through the same procedure, but we found the same result. They think more about the future than the past. So the lack of age differences, I have to say, was another surprise.
Yeah. So this next question is about, and it dovetails with one that I had too, is about if you've thought about or have looked into social differences or looked at the life situations in relation to thoughts. And my question was, any thoughts about cultural differences here? If you went to different cultures, do you think this would hold up, or have you thought about that?
Well, yeah, I could only speculate. there. I mean, it would be fascinating to know, uh, but and there are cultural differences and cultural differences. I mean, we could go up to Canada and run the same study
Right.
and call that study cross-cultural. And no disrespect to Canadians, but they aren't really wildly different. Um, and and then Europeans are the next most studied, and Asians. I think the ones you'd really want, if you could do it, would be hunter-gatherer populations in Africa or in the more remote parts of Asia. But they don't have cell phones, so and getting them to comply, that would be considerably more difficult. So all I can say is fascinating, important question, and we just don't know. I hesitate to generalize about human nature based on citizens of Chicago,
Yeah.
but
Great.
that's the best we got.
Yeah. Thank you. This next one says, a great presentation, enjoyed listening. Could you please comment on how we can translate your findings into other scientific researches as predictor or mediating factors? I'm a digital health scientist trying to understand human behavior and create interventions through digital environment. We state of mind and perception are highly effective um, in their digital behaviors. These are highly likely to affect behavior change interventions.
Well, I didn't quite understand the question.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think it's especially some of the valence and meaningfulness and the affect related to thought patterns. Is there a way, like, I think, how would you translate this, or is there a way to predict or mediate as mediating factors when looking at interventions on how people are behaving, I think, in digital environments in their own thought life?
okay. Well, in the first place, these are not specifically digital environments. The point of the experience sampling is people go about their day as they do normally, and so they would spend as much time online as they would normally. Certainly, that's gone up for us in the Western civilization rather sharply in the last couple decades, and especially in the last month or two, as many of us are spending all day online. Um, but in terms of translating the findings, I'm not sure quite what to say. I'm a basic researcher and trying to understand as much as we can about ordinary thought processes and behaviors and so on. My colleagues who study interventions of how to change people and make them better, I know they need results to deal with people today, but that that's a separate area of inquiry. You could certainly do studies like this. I think that it'd be really helpful in the context of someone who's undergoing an intervention, and then you could track them and see how they're coping things and how their thoughts and feelings might change. Ideally, you'd have some baseline data before they start the intervention, and then some afterwards. In terms of in terms of applications, I think the idea of focusing on the present, the mindfulness, is something that is popular in a lot of interventions, and other people have been openly skeptical about it as well. So I think our data present something for both sides, dwelling on past and future is more likely to generate anxiety. And as I said, if you can get your thoughts and focus right here, right now, well, things are not as bad as they might appear to be. The threats lie in the future. But again, there's a cost in meaningfulness, that meaningful human experience integrates across time. So there is some loss in forcing people to do that, but maybe that's good. And if you've got problems, psychological issues that you're struggling with, then they're likely to be meaningful. And so getting into the present might get rid of some of those meanings, and along the way, get rid of some of the negative emotions. The one other thing I would say is, again, remember that a lot of problems go with thinking about the past. I'm reminded of a line my friend and colleague Roxy Silver, who studied people with all sorts of traumas and difficulties. She studied, people whose houses have burned down and people who were abused as children and imprisoned and all sorts of bad things. And one nutshell summary she gave me some years ago that I thought was really a profound insight. She says, basically, people who are looking back at the past aren't doing so well. People who are looking forward to the future are doing better. And, many people have suffered serious traumas and bad things. Many people have had minor or lesser ones. No life is free of problems. But if you're looking back at the bad things that happened, and the more you're stuck on that, the less adaptive it is. And you can get people to moving forward and looking at the future. Some of the people she'd studied, the trauma had occurred 20, 30 years ago. It's like abused as child. Why did he or she do that to me? And continuing to search for answers and so on, which the mind may naturally do in some cases, because it's sort of unresolved. But that sort of keeps you trapped in the backward-looking victim mode, and there's no category of happy victim. So I'd say the adaptive and constructive thing, if you can get people's minds out of the past and onto the future, that's probably healthier and happier.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that interesting implications for counseling techniques and therapies too. So thank you. This person has a question about compliance rate. How long did you allow people to respond after the prompt? Did you block off that period? So was it a convenient sampling or was it set? And what was the response percentage to prompts?
Okay. Yeah, I think the average was about 14 out of 18. So everybody on average missed a couple, and some missed more than others. So we told them. Now I have these confused, and I'd have to look up in the procedure of exactly what the rules and instructions were, and it does make a difference. I can say when we did the desire study, which is also relevant, I know we didn't know people might only have one desire a week. And there we were getting 6 days, I think, from people. We thought we might not have enough data if we asked you, are you desiring something right now? So if they said not now, then they could report on a desire they've had up to half an hour ago. It's harder to do that with thoughts because people don't necessarily remember their thoughts, and everybody's thinking all the time, I assume. So if you ask you, have you had a thought in the past half hour? Of course, everybody's had a thought. Everybody's had a whole lot of them, and then they would pick one, and then you're stuck with how are they, picking one of the most interesting thoughts or one of the ones they're least embarrassed about or whatever. So that procedure that worked for the desire didn't work for thoughts. So we had them pretty much report on just what thought, the most recent thought in their mind. Now, no one was saying, I have to go to the bathroom. So there may have been a little bit of censorship. I assume people think that now and then. Mm-hmm. Or if there were, it was just in the other category. What else was there in that question? I mean, the compliance. Yeah.
I think that, yeah, I had a related question actually about how you framed, the description of their thoughts. It appeared that you had a list that you gave them and they picked other. There was another option as well. So I was wondering how you formatted that question and what was the theory behind that? What was the basis for that?
Okay, and remember, we didn't give this to everyone all the time. But there were questions about the content of the thought. So if they said they were thinking about the past, then those items came up one by one. It was just yes or no. Mm-hmm. So were you thinking about the past? Were you, I forget the categories. We can go back to the graph here. There we go. So if they said they're thinking about the present, so it was asked, are you enjoying, savoring the moment? Or are you surprised? And so they could say yes or no. And obviously they could say yes to a lot of them, or they could say no to all of them. Initially, we had a much longer list of the possible thoughts, but Hoffman said, that's just way too long a list. You need to cut it down to the major ones. And as anyone who runs these studies knows, you have a trade-off between all the information you want to get from the people and the limits of what people will actually respond to. And the more onerous the questionnaire is, the more the non-compliance rate goes up. So does that answer that?
Yeah. That is a complication. So, well, thank you so much, Dr. Baumeister, for your time and for this interesting study on thought. It's a lot to think about. So hope you have a good rest of your day. Thank you all. And so we'll go ahead and transition to our next speaker now, Jennifer Veyu. So thanks again, Dr. Baumeister. And now I'll introduce.
Thank you, and bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Okay.